Hey everyone, Tactics here, and with Season 3 now getting a confirmed date of August 12th, I figured I'd tackle one of the most asked questions during my streams and give my current thoughts on all 6 tank specs and how they're looking on the PTR now that we've been able to actually play with some of the new changes, the new tier sets in both Mythic Plus and Raid. Of course, the PTR cycle is not done yet, and I expect at least a couple more sets of significant changes to drop before the season launches, so please do take that into account. Some of the things I say here may be inaccurate as of next week if there are some significant changes, but everything in this video is going to include all of the PTR builds up to and including July 17th. Anything past that, not going to be considered in this video. So let's just get right into it. And to start, let's talk about a tank that's been getting a lot of buzz recently. That is Brewmaster Monk. Of course, they received a minor rework. I'm not going to say it's like a full rework. They had some new talents introduced to help with damage smoothing and sustain, and it looks like they've done their job pretty well. They had a shuffle in the positioning of certain talents, and then they had some pretty significant buffs to Nujao, the Ox cooldown, which has been something that Brewmaster players have kind of avoided taking entirely in their talent tree, which is obviously something Blizzard did not want to see given how iconic that cooldown is and all the Celestial cooldowns are to the Monk class. There are a couple kind of popular talent builds currently popping up on the PTR. One of them is a Rushing Jadewind build that actually drops Breath of Fire entirely to actually amp up the Ox effects. I know a lot of people, myself included, are not Rushing Jadewind fans. I am a big hater of Rushing Jadewind, but honestly, after having played this build a little bit without Breath of Fire to also fill in those globals, it actually doesn't feel too bloated, and I actually did enjoy playing it. If you are a true Rushing Jadewind hater, though, there is a special delivery build that people are still playing with Breath of Fire, sometimes going Dragonfire Brew to amp up that a little bit. But I do think the Rushing Jadewind build is slightly better because of how it interacts with your Ox. But again, if you don't want to play it, you don't have to. It's not a huge loss. In both cases, you are actually speccing into those Ox talent nodes now. You get a ton of uptime since in the Mythic Plus builds anyways, a lot of them are running Shadow Pan, and then they're also running Call to Arms, which summons the Ox when you press Weapons of Order, which you're also getting a lot of CDR on because you're Shadow Pan, right? Your Ox is actually dealing damage. Some of these new talents are making your Stagger stronger, low health. You're getting more self-healing as well, and I think one of the Orb ones has been bugged for a lot of beta testing, which was recently fixed again, so hopefully it's actually working this time. But overall, I think these changes actually gave Brewmaster kind of exactly what they've needed. As a noob Brewmaster myself, I only kind of play it during PTR cycles for the last couple of expansions. This is like the most durable I felt playing Brewmaster, so that is something to note. Again, most of these builds are focused on Shadowpan. Master of Harmony was falling a little bit behind, but they've actually been buffed a significant amount the last couple builds. And my understanding is it's very solid now. It could actually be like a Mythic Plus versus a Raid angle where like Shadowpan's Mythic Plus, maybe Master of Harmony is Raid respectively, but I'm not fully sure on the details when it comes to Master of Harmony specifically. Damage wise, in a Mythic Plus environment, I think Brewmaster kind of benefits from their single target and AoE builds being quite similar. So they actually get very, very powerful single target damage in the Mythic Plus build, which is a very large benefit. Defensively, Brew is still Brewmaster, right? They still have Stagger. They're still taking a lot of passive damage. They still can't quite cleanse it all off themselves and self-heal and fully sustain, so they are going to need some more passive external healing. But if you look at healers, are looking quite strong right now in Mythic Plus. Resto Druid is like right at the top of the list, and that is a really, really fantastic pairing with Brewmaster. So I think, well, this is not, you know, a full extensive rework that some Brewmaster players were wanting, some massive overhauls to Oct or something like that. It does kind of boost up the weaknesses of Brewmaster, and their damage output has been really, really solid. So I think Brew is in a very good place both in Raids and Mythic Plus. Moving on to Prot Warrior. So Colossus was obviously the meta spec in both Mythic Plus and Raids in Season 2. And early on in the PTR, it was feeling very, very good. It had huge sustain from the buffed bleed damage from the tier set combined with the buffed fueled by violence talent, which gives you health back for that bleed damage. This has just been recently tuned down to more reasonable levels after a couple sets of nerf, both to the bleed damage and to the healing from the talent itself. But it's still a very nice addition to Colossus specifically because they do so much bleed damage. This actually kind of scales your self-healing into larger pull counts, and you end up wanting to always pull mobs onto like bosses or individual targets who actually boost your sustain from these additional mobs, which is kind of interesting. Very similar to like the old Blood Frenzy from Guardian Druid back in Season 2, which, spoiler alert, did get nerfed and target capped, but there looks like they haven't done that yet to Fueled by Violence. Speaking on Mountain Thane briefly, this was something that was kind of not great initially, very boring tier set. It's gotten a couple buffs now and a rework to the 4-piece, which is now very, very nice. And that has kind of slingshotted it ahead of Colossus, both in AoE and single target. Honestly, maybe their damage is a bit too high right now. It might end up getting nerfed over the next couple weeks. That's my guess if I had to make one. But I think the biggest thing is that you do definitely feel that loss of spell block a little bit more as Mountain Thane, because you don't have that big bleed damage that Colossus has, so you can't benefit from the buffed Fueled by Violence as much, right? Mountain Thane is probably like 10%, maybe less of your damage is coming from those bleeds, whereas Colossus is more like 25 to 30% of your damage coming from those bleeds. So bleeds just don't make it up enough of your damage to actually have Fueled by Violence heal you enough, so you are losing out by sustain playing Mountain Thane over Colossus while you do gain that damage. Of course, some of the talents I still would like to see adjusted. Spellbreaker, they've reworked this, or not reworked, buffed, I would say, I guess, a couple times. It's still just a small percent chance to do a large DR on a tank is just not what they want from a defensive. I can see the argument if this is an offensive talent, but if it's defense that you're looking for, you want something reliable and predictable as a tank player, and this is just not it. As for some options, obviously you could do things like passives here, but I think you could also do something interesting with the Bitter Immunity talent. This is something that basically hasn't been picked very much at all in the entire existence of the new talent trees. So you could maybe put an empowerment here in the tree on that choice node instead of Spellbreaker, where you like reduce the cooldown by a minute, so it's now a 2-minute cooldown. And also you can let it cleanse magic debuffs and bleeds, basically turning it into a powered up Kyrian file. I think would be very, very good. You could maybe even argue that this should be the baseline version of the spell in the class tree because, again, of that very, very low pick rate. But that, I think, is another conversation entirely. It would just be cool to have something to solve that weakness of Prot Warrior right now, those debuffs they have no other way to clear, because there are quite a lot of them this season. The other thing, Last Stand, it remains very, very weak on its own. It's basically just a tax to grab Thunderlord right now, which doesn't impact Colossus too much. They just kind of forego Thunderlord entirely, but obviously Mountain Thane really, really wants that because they are Thunderclapping and Thunderblasting so much. Would be nice to see them maybe roll Bolster and or Unnerving Focus just into Last Stand baseline, or maybe you could even add some sort of magic damage reduction to Last Stand as well to kind of make up for that spell block loss. Playstyle wise, there isn't really a lot changing for Prot Warrior going into the patch. Colossus does have a bit more focus on bleeds, like I've been talking about. Mountain Thane's going to be Thunder Blasting more thanks to the 4-piece rework. The main difference is that the existing playstyles have a bit more passive talent synergy. So Colossus is getting that self-sustain attached to their bleed, so they're going to be having a lot more self-healing. Mountain Thane is going to be Thunder Blasting a lot more, so they're going to be having more uptime on that Thunder Blast DR, and they're going to be having more CDR on Demo Shout from Thunderlord, as well as just more Rage Generation, which they already had a ton of. Tuning wise, Prot Warrior remains one of the top damage tanks at the moment, regardless of if you're picking Colossus or Mountain Thane, which is always a nice spot to be in, assuming you don't get slapped down by the Nerf Hammer, which brings us to our next tank, Prot Paladin. I'm sure a lot of people have been seeing the clips or videos of Lightsmith Prot Paladin doing an insane amount of damage, but unfortunately it flew just a little bit too close to the sun and it has been smacked down, maybe even excessively nerfed, I would say. Probably a little too far. The spec does still have a few negative bugs working against it on the PTR, so it isn't as bad as it seems, but I still think maybe a little much, That being said, if you're a Templar enjoyer, you're probably feeling pretty good because that spec was previously very, very bugged, and those have mostly been fixed going into the recent PTR build, and you can actually now see how it's performing, and it's doing quite well in both Raid and Mythic Plus. I will say, after the Lightsmith nerfs, Paladin's damage compared to other tanks is going to be on like the mid to low end again this season, kind of similar to the previous season, Season 2, but again, their utility kit is just unmatched. No one can bring the utility of Paladin. It makes them a fantastic choice as a raid tank, where the tank's personal damage is a bit less important, and also, of course, a fantastic tank for pugging Mythic Plus, where your utility can kind of carry groups. Speaking of Mythic Plus, I think there are actually some very good changes for Paladin, completely unrelated to the spec itself and actually related to the dungeon pool. Currently in Season 2, Blizzard have changed their philosophy to be very heavy on the melee damage intake and less so in terms of magic tank busters or other sources of damage, which has been problematic for Paladin, particularly after the nerfs to their parry going into Season 2. Melee swings were kind of their weakness because they don't have enough uptime on their cooldowns to kind of chain everything, at least not with the current gear level. In Season 3, we're seeing quite a few changes to your damage intake. So first off, you're getting a lot more debuffs. So things like bleeds, things like damage amps, or just magic dots, that kind of thing, which is something Paladin's very, very good at. Of course, they have their mastery, which is, as long as they're in Consecrate, they have a lot of DR against these kinds of debuffs, and they also have the ability to immune them in a variety of ways. Their bubble taunt, of course, they can drop any kind of bleed. Their spell warding, maybe bop in certain niche situations, and of course they can be a dwarf, which is also less detrimental now that shadow meld potions are a thing. The other type of damage intake that is making a bit of a return here is spam cast bolts. Currently, all 3 of the Shadowlands dungeons have casters that specifically target the tank. There's usually more than one of them in a pull, and it's just these interruptible bolts, which again, Paladin is very, very good against. Not only can they interrupt these mobs on their own, usually a single one fully and 2 of them partially, they also will just able to block spells, and the only tank able to do so, now that spell block for warriors has been removed, and these mobs usually have significantly lower melee damage because of those bolt abilities. So just by the slight adjustment to damage intake in a few of these dungeons, it does make it a little bit nicer to be a paladin. Are paladins the most durable tank? No, but they do feel tankier in this coming season compared to Season 2, so that is a big plus. They are still going to struggle with that melee swing damage, right? Their self-sustain is still fairly lacking, kind of similar to Brewmaster, and so potentially you can run into problems as key levels go up. Maybe you need a bit more healer attention. Hard to say because PTR testing, we don't go super, super, super high. At least I personally don't. But overall, the spec is still solid, and I expect you're going to see a lot of them early on in the season and in Mythic Raid progression. From there, we can talk about Blood DK. As I discussed in my initial video, Blood did lose a fair bit of damage with the first set of changes on the PTR, and unsurprisingly, we've kind of seen buff after buff to try and bring their damage back up. They're not the highest damage tank currently, but they are doing much more respectable DPS now, so that is a good positive. It does definitely feel bad, especially in Mythic Plus, to lose out on A-Bomb Limb and have a nerfed version of AMZ, especially when Blood DK was already lacking in terms of utility they're bringing to a group, right? Death Grips are minor at best, I would say. AMS is kind of niche in the value. Season 2 was kind of the most I've seen AMS be valuable to a group, honestly, but you could bring that from a DPS DK, and so there wasn't really anything kind of tying you to Blood, and of course their defensive uptime in keys made things a bit problematic. And that kind of brings me to Deathbringer. I kind of wish they stuck with the dancing rune weapon thing. So the initial changes to Deathbringer gave your size a 25% chance to give you some dancing rune weapon. They changed that to be a 100% chance to grant 2 seconds of Bone Storm, but it's kind of a weird thing to give Deathbringer, right? They're already marrow rending so much that managing your Bone Shield is like the least of your worries. It's really not a problem at all. And so what they kind of need more of, at least to make this better in Mythic Plus, is either more rune weapon uptime or the ability to CDR rune weapon more, which giving Bone Storm does neither of, right? And so I would really like to see them experiment with a 100% chance to grant dancing rune weapon instead of Bone Storm. Right, go back to the dancing rune weapon, give it a 100% chance instead of a 25% chance, which was the initial iteration. Or maybe if they don't want to specifically give you dancing rune weapon, giving a CDR on dancing rune weapon I think would also be very beneficial, because at least to me that seems to be where Blood DK has been struggling the most when it comes to Mythic Plus keys ever since the loss of that tier set in Shadowlands Season 4. As things currently stand, Blood DK is kind of in the same situation as it is right now in Season 2. It's solid, but not the best in Raid. Maybe there's some unique grips that'll change that, but also maybe you'll just bring a DPS DK to do those grips. They're a bit of a weaker option when it comes to Mythic Plus. They kind of have that similar benefit of Paladin, where some of these bleeds, some of these other magic debuffs, some of these magic bolts do make it easier for Blood DK because they're much better at handling that damage type, but they just don't come with the same utility kit as Paladin. Again, the tank spec totally fine for pushing your plus 12s, pushing your Keystone Legend, but if your goal is the 0.1% title, you're probably gonna have an easier time playing something else. That brings us to a Guardian Druid, which has seen some ups and downs. So Elun's Chosen has seen some nerfs as well as a buff in the most recent PTR build that we got today. The nerfs were a bit surprising to me personally, as I didn't feel like in my testing that this tier bonus was particularly strong. And they said in their nerfing of this tier bonus, when they took away the extra proc of Lunation CDR from that 2-piece Star Surge, that it was a more powerful interaction than intended. I thought it was a little bit more interesting having that interaction, and even with that interaction, I didn't think it was too powerful. And obviously, after those nerfs, Blizzard seemed to agree because they increased the strength of the Star Surge proc by 250%, with a massive, massive buff. So obviously, they realized after the fact it was not strong, but this kind of is, the same issue I've been harping on, particularly about Guardian Druid, but obviously other specs have had this issue as well, where you don't really get these interesting tier bonuses that impact your gameplay or affect things like your cooldowns. You just get something that is totally passive, just happens, doesn't impact your gameplay whatsoever. You don't change your talents, you don't change how you play the spec, and it's disappointing to me because that's how I saw tier sets. Historically, that's what I enjoyed about tier sets, is being able to have a little bit different gameplay playing the same spec from patch to patch, and just haven't gotten that at all this expansion as a Guardian Druid, which is a little bit unfortunate. Now, haven't quite had a chance to play with the buffs of this tier bonus yet, but despite it being a large bonus, I don't expect it to do too much for Elun's Chosen in the damage department, because it was a hero tree that was already struggling with damage. It was one of the lower ends of the damage outputs for Mythic Plus builds for tanks, specifically in single target. It was quite bad. And with the tier set previously being bad and now being brought, a little bit closer to what the other tank tier sets are doing with like 20+% damage increases, it may close the gap slightly, but I don't think it's going to push Elun's Chosen over the edge in terms of damage. Moving on to Druid of the Claw, they actually got some passive defensive improvements, mainly targeted at Mythic Plus. So things like your Mangle healing has been multiplied by 5. Instead of 1% of your health, is now healing for 5% of your health. They increased the DR on Dreadful Wound by 5%. They gave you a passive 2% magic DR when you're not spec'd into the Cat Weaving node. And so you combine all this stuff with the 2-piece that gives you some more haste and crit, as well as the additional uptime on that Dreadful Wound DR that you're getting from the 4-piece. And this surprisingly made it feel quite good in keys, much better than I was personally expecting. I've tested out in a few keys now, and like 80+% uptime on that Dreadful Wound DR is what I was getting pretty consistently, plus an extra like 60+% uptime on Tooth and Claw DR as well, and a lot of the times those were overlapping, of course. So you actually have quite a bit of passive DR. It's still not going to be as consistent as Elun's Chosen, right? But I am interested. I'm probably going to be messing around with a bit more Druid of the Claw keys, just to kind of see exactly, are we actually going to run into a problem where we just get unlucky with Ravage procs and we just don't get a proc and we just kind of die, right? I am interested in seeing if that ever does become a problem, because one thing, Druid of the Claw is miles ahead in damage output compared to Elun's Chosen. So if you are able to make that work, it's going to be very good. At the very least, it's going to be a fun weekly key build to play if it's a little less consistent than Elun's Chosen, if you're not able to survive those highest level of keys with it, but it's still fun. I know I did promise Guardians a rant a little while ago, but of course all the news of the patch and the release date has kind of pushed that back a little bit. Don't worry, I am still taking notes, I am still writing it, and I will probably release that as like a midnight wish list later on in the patch once the whirlwind of the initial launch is over. So be on the lookout for that, maybe, a month or two from now. That brings us to the current reigning champion of Mythic Plus, Vengeance Demon Hunter, which has not really been touched going into Season 3, which, low-key, personally, that is surprising. I was expecting some sort of touch, even if it's just like a light nerf to them. I was expecting something, but it turns out just absolutely nothing really has happened to them in terms of their utility, in terms of their durability, anything like that. So they're still an exceptionally sturdy tank against all kinds of damage intake. They still have the same, mob control ability, AoE, silence, interrupt, all that stuff. So they still have that. So it's still very, very strong. Tank spec, they're still the only tank spec here outside of Guardian Druid, which is going to actually buff caster DPS. So if it's a caster meta, that obviously is an advantage it has over tanks like Prot Warrior, over tanks like Brewmaster. One thing of note is that one of the key weaknesses of Demon Hunters would be healing reductions, and there are actually a few healing reductions that can stack up quite high on the PTR right now in the new season. So this is potentially a weakness for them. Is it going to be the end of Demon Hunter? I doubt it. You can probably just play around it and play less of these mobs specifically in those dungeons, but it is something to note that is kind of a weakness of theirs that is coming a little bit more into play in this season. Plus, of course, Shadow Mount potions, all the other tanks are going to be able to do those skips, so it's going to be less of a Demon Hunter niche thing. The other thing to keep in mind is that even without a nerf, their personal damage is going down a little bit relative to other tanks, both with some of the changes as well as just having higher damage tier sets. Tanks like Prot Warrior, tanks like Brewmaster, which we just mentioned, do actually do a significant amount more personal damage than Vengeance right now on the PTR. But again, if you're playing a magic comp, that 3% magic damage is going to likely overcome the difference in personal damage. That being said, if you're playing a physical comp, the strength of Battle Shout and Mystic Touch being significantly more than that of the Fellbrand is obviously going to push you even more in the direction of those tanks. So it kind of is dependent on what DPS end up being meta. Are we going to be in a magic damage meta, physical damage meta? Who knows? But that could actually lean you away from Vengeance Demon Hunter if you're trying to buff your DPS. For raid, I would say they probably have a similar problem to Guardian Druid, where they themselves don't actually bring anything unique outside of their raid buff. So if you're going to be bringing a Havoc for that Demon Hunter buff, then to actually want to bring a Vengeance Demon Hunter in like an optimal comp, they need to be the best tank at something, and they just aren't right now, specifically in a raid environment. Maybe you could stretch and say like Sigil of Chains is unique utility, right, because it's an AoE grip, but obviously Blood DK also has that in War Fiends, plus they also have the individual grips as well. And just generally, the other mob control from Demon Hunter is not nearly as important in a raid environment where you have 20 people who can have CCs available versus a Mythic Plus environment where you only have 5, so it loses a lot of value there. Similar to Prot Warrior, not really much is changing for Demon Hunter playstyle wise. The specs just kind of do better at what they already did. Eldraki is still going to be looking like the top dog in Mythic Plus. Belsgard is looking like the play in Raid. Specs are going to feel basically the same, which for some is negative, as gameplay is not changing from tier to tier. Right? Personally, that was something I really enjoyed about tier sets. Seems like it's less of a thing for tanks this expansion, but it is what it is. If you enjoyed the gameplay of Season 2 Demon Hunter, Season 3 is just more that. But there we have it, guys. That's my current thoughts on tanks during Season 3 PTR testing. I would love to know what you guys think. What are you currently planning on maining in the new patch? Let me know down in the comments below. And of course, make sure you are subscribed for more tank, raid, and Mythic Plus guide content. Of course, I could not make any of these videos without the support of all my amazing Patreons. So thank you guys so much. And I'll see everyone in the next video.